Hey everyone, how are you doing? I've got a big cup of tea because I have a huge amount of new books that I want to talk to you about. There's some really interesting new books that are being published in the UK in October, and then I have a pile of books that I bought on Bookshop Day, and so yeah, there's a huge amount to get through and that I'm really excited about. So I think I'm going to be well stocked going into winter for things to read. So let's get into talking about them. First, there is Bridge of Clay, the new novel by Markus Zusak. He is the author of The Book Thief, and this is his new novel about 5 brothers who grow up in isolation, and they don't have any parental influence or guidance, but then their father returns one day and says, let's make a bridge. And so it's about the lives of these brothers, their process of becoming adults in that situation. And I was invited to an event yesterday at Waterstones Piccadilly, where they were actually building, in honor of this book, building a bridge out of books. And I got to see the construction of this bridge within the bookstore, and it's amazing. It's up on the top level of the bookstore. You can go and see it, and it was really impressive seeing this giant bridge of books going up in the bookshop. So that was really unique and interesting to see. So really interested to read his new book. Then there is Barbara Kingsolver's new novel Unsheltered, and this has the most beautiful edge pages on it. Look at those pages which go into meld into the design at the front of the book. It's just so beautiful, and I love Barbara Kingsolver's writing so much. I think her novel The Lacuna is one of the greatest novels, as I talked about in a previous video, of the 21st century so far. She's amazing, and I've started reading this novel, and it's incredible already. It's sort of a novel in 2 parts. Part is in the 1800s in this small sort of utopian community in America, or an intentional community. And then in the present day, within that community, of a family who's really struggling and living in a broken down house within that community. And her writing is so relevant and gripping and emotional, and yeah, I'm really enjoying it so far, and this is a beautiful book. Next, there is a novel I'm really interested in and excited about. It's called Like a Sword Wound by Ahmet, Altan. He's a Turkish writer, and this is the first book in a series of 4 books about Turkey over, I think, that charts the end of the Ottoman Empire. And he's a really interesting writer because he's currently imprisoned. And he's imprisoned on charges of sedition. He's an advocate for Kurdish and Armenian minorities, and the writer Elif Shafak has been advocating for his release from prison because he's serving a life sentence. And yeah, I think it's really interesting how apparently themes in this novel reflect his current experience under this somewhat oppressive government. And so this is the first book in a series of books which has been compared and called sort of the Turkish War and Peace. Tirzah and the Prince of Crows by Deborah K. Davies. This is a novel by the same author of the book Reason She Goes to the Woods, which I read a few years ago when it was longlisted for the Bailey's Prize. And she is such a unique and interesting writer. The way she uses language, and it's just very unique. And this novel is set in a small village in Wales. It's about a girl who grows up in a very religious family and finds that somewhat oppressive, and then she meets a young man who she falls for, and she tries to seek out an alternative life from this small, very religiously controlled village that she grew up in. And I'm so excited to read this because I think she's such a unique writer. Little by Edward Carey. This is a novel which has been talked about a lot because it's a really unique historical novel about the woman who created Madame Tussaud. So it's about Madame Tussaud herself and her childhood growing up in France and narrowly escaping being killed in the French Revolution, and then her artwork creating these wax model figures and eventually turning it into a museum of celebrities. And so like I never want to visit a Madame Tussauds because I think they're like ghastly museums, but I'm really interested in her life story. Next are a couple of non-fiction books, and the first is an essay called Limbo by Dan Fox, which is put out by Fitzcarraldo Editions. And this is an essay about these sort of intermediate periods we find where it feels like we're not involved in doing one thing or another, and it's his examination of this state of life, which I think is kind of very similar to the type of nonfiction work that Olivia Lane does of examining this state of existence, which we think of as not being really productive or interesting, but actually it's a kind of gestation period of when we're evolving into a different state of being. And so yeah, he talks about that limbo state of being. And then there is the book called Insomnia by Marina Benjamin. And this is another nonfiction book examining the state of insomnia. And I suffer from sleeplessness myself quite a lot. I don't know if I would call it insomnia or not. I've never tried to like have it diagnosed or a condition about it, but yeah, but her examining this state and not necessarily, I think we think of it in such a negative way, and it can have a big negative effect on our lives, but she examines it more as an existential state, and so looking at it as this state of mind that we're in towards working out things in our lives. This is a really exciting novel called XX by Angela Chadwick. It's published by a new imprint called Dialogue Books, and it's about this situation where a technology is discovered where two women can have a female child just by themselves without a man. It's called ovum to ovum technology, and so it's about all of the issues surrounding that if a situation like that would arise, all the political and emotional and mental issues that go around that situation. So I think it sounds like a really interesting premise for a novel. This is a book of posthumous stories, Night Train by Thom Jones. These are new and selected stories from previous collections. He's an author that died a couple of years ago, and he's a writer that's described as the characters he writes about are grifters and drifters, rogues and ne'er-do-wells, some lovable, some not, but each with a voice that never fails to grab you by the collar. And there is, he's a writer that's been endorsed by Joyce Carol Oates, my favorite writer, and she says his writing is bleakly and courageously comic. Reading Thom Jones' fiction is like speeding in an open car. The landscape blurs, the momentum becomes intoxicating, and then the brakes are applied with no warning. Silence is My Mother Tongue by Sulaiman Addonia. This is a novel about a girl named Saba who arrives at an East African refugee camp with her younger brother who's a mute, and it's about their process of trying to find their way in the world while also resisting traditional gender roles and ways of living in society. So it sounds like a really important new voice. A Spark of Light by Jodi Picoult. And I've never read a Jodi Picoult novel, but I've always been intrigued to, because I don't know if you know this, but Jodi Picoult was an author of Joyce Carol Oates. And I always bring it back around to Joyce Carol Oates, don't I? But yeah, so I've always been intrigued to read her, but just never got around to to reading her writing. And her previous novel, I think, was about race relations, and this novel is another sort of issue novel, which is about the issue of abortion, and particularly about anti-abortion protesters. And it's a novel about an individual protester to abortions who takes hold of an abortion clinic and sort of holds everyone in the clinic to ransom. And it's interesting that she would write about that subject because Joyce Carol Oates also wrote really grippingly about that subject, about religious extremists protesting abortion clinics in her novel, A Book of American Martyrs. So let me know whether you've read any Jodi Picoult or not, and if you think I should read her. Next, I have a few new Irish novels, and the first, I'm so excited about this novel because I read this author, Paraic O'Donnell's previous novel called The Maker of Swans, and it was such a unique novel. He writes in this sort of absurdist type style, which is so like interesting. I've never read anything like it before. And this novel is called The House on Vesper Sands. And it's a historical novel taking place in London in the late Victorian period, and is about a group of characters in London, but particularly a well-known high-class man who's a philanthropist and who goes missing, and also a woman who shows up who can barely speak and who is a very mysterious woman, and about the interplay of their relationship with each other and secrets which take place in this house called Vesper Sands. The Vogue by Ian McNane. This is a novel with a plot which is a bit hard to describe. So it's about names that have long since been changed and children long since cast out, but some things refuse to be forgotten. Set against an eerie landscape awash with secrets, The Vogue is a poetic dance through a deeply religious community with its abandoned military base and long-shuttered children's home. And it comes adorned with a group of blurbs from Irish authors that I really like Sebastian Barry and Lucy Caldwell, who's a really interesting writer of short stories, and Anna Burns, who's currently shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Under the Night by Alan Glynn. He is a writer of previously the novel The Dark Fields, which was made into a film called Limitless, and it was a best-selling novel and a really successful movie. And this novel is about a covert operation by the CIA in the 1950s of psychoactive drugs, and a man experiences this drug which opens up new avenues of his brain, and it's about many years later his grandson going back and trying to find out what happened to his grandfather. The Merry Spinster by Danielle Mallory Ortberg. This sounds like a perfect book of short stories for autumn because it's described as tales as everyday horror. They are updates of traditional children's stories and fairy tales with elements of psychological horror, emotional clarity, and a keen sense of feminist mischief. and it's been blurbed by Carmen Maria Machado, whose book of short stories I read earlier this year, Her Body and Other Parties, which I really enjoyed. So sounds like really cutting edge, interesting new writer of updates of fairy tales, which I'm totally into. The Winter Soldier by Daniel Mason. This is a novel about a young medical student in Vienna in 1914 when World War I breaks out, and he's conscripted into the army, and he thinks he's going to go work in this well-run medical facility, but then he finds out that it's actually a very remote village up in the mountains, and it's very poorly run, and there's this mysterious nun who I think lives there, and it's about the relationship they develop with each other and struggling to provide medical service in very strained circumstances. The Cactus by Sarah Haywood. This is a novel about an ordinary woman living and working in modern-day London, and how she finds it difficult to get emotionally close to people. She has a bit of a prickly personality, hence it's called the Cactus, but she experiences the loss of her mother and finds out unexpectedly that she is pregnant, and that changes her life and the way that she relates to people. Next I have a couple novels by the same author called Leif Enger, and there's a reprint of his first novel called Peace Like a River, and then his new novel called Virgil Wander, which is about a man who unexpectedly drives off the road, has a really bad car accident, and arrives in this small town which has a lot of problems and issues, and he gradually becomes involved in the colorful characters of this small town and all of the issues that this depressed community faces. And finally, I have a memoir called Blood Ties by Ben Crane. This is a memoir about his experiences of getting into falconry and training birds, and how it became a sort of method by which he was able to better emotionally connect with people, because he suffers from Asperger's syndrome, and he particularly found that when he had a son, he wasn't able to become emotionally close to him. And so it's about his process of trying to connect with other people and getting through this condition which he has. And so obviously the parallels can be drawn with the memoir H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald, which is a memoir I loved so much. So really interested to read this. And then finally, I have a whole group of books which I went out and bought on Bookshop Day, which I obviously didn't need to do because I already have too much to read, but I've been so interested and intrigued by these books that I just loved the chance to go out and buy them on Bookshop Day. It gave me a great excuse to actually get them. So first there is Despised and Rejected by Rose Allatini, and this is a novel which was first published in 1918 and which has been republished by Persephone books in their beautiful editions, and look, in the inside cover is really lovely as well. And this is really interesting because it's a novel written by a woman about a gay man, and it was first published in 1918, so it was obviously quite controversial. Only 800 copies of it were first published, and then it was sort of judged to be, what is the quote? It was deemed to be morally unhealthy and most pernicious. And after this judgment came out, the remaining 200 copies of the books, which hadn't been sold yet, were seized and destroyed. So it's such an interesting story behind this novel. I'll put a link below to Persephone's website where they have a copy of this article which was brought out about this book at the time that it was published. And yeah, so really interesting that it's coming back into print, and sounds like a really interesting historical novel. I also got a copy of If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin, which I've read other books by James Baldwin before, but I've not read this one, and a film is coming out really soon of this book. So it's about a young woman who's pregnant and living in Harlem, and the father of her child is in prison accused for rape, and sort of about the struggles of this small family. And bringing it back to Joyce Carol Oates, because I always bring it back to Joyce Carol Oates, there's a quote on the back by her who says, "If Beale Street Could Talk affirms not only love between a man and a woman, but love of a type that is dealt with only rarely in contemporary fiction, that between members of a family." Resistance by Julian Fuchs. I'm going to pronounce his surname Fuchs. You could pronounce the name another way, but I won't do that. And it's translated by Daniel Hahn. This is about a couple living in Argentina during the military dictatorship, and how they escape Argentina and try to make a new lives for themselves in Brazil. Next is a book called Fish Soup by Margarita Garcia Roballo. She is a Colombian writer, and this book comprises 2 novellas and a book of short stories. and her writing is described as at once blunt and poetic as she delves into the lives of her characters who simultaneously evoke sympathy and revulsion, challenging the reader's loyalties throughout the remarkable universe that is Fish Soup. And I've heard such good things about this book that I'm really intrigued to get to it. History of Violence by Edouard Louis. He is a French writer. This is his second novel. He's a very young French writer. I loved his first novel, The End of Eddie, and this is a novel which I think is also semi-autobiographical about his experiences going to university and meeting a man who rapes him, and the experience of the emotional trauma of that and trying to deal with that experience. West by Davies. I've heard such good things about this short novel. It's about a man who's a settler in America and how he goes out to try to find this new land and leaves his young daughter at home all by herself because he's widowed, and about his experiences pioneering this new area of the country and her experiences as she's grown into womanhood on her own. The Cemetery in Barns by Gabriel Josopovici, and I wanted to get this short novel because it is currently on the shortlist for the Goldsmiths Prize, which is a prize that awards experimental fiction, and it does sound like quite an experimental novel, which is sort of poetic and elegiac, the plot revolves around a translator who lives in different locations like Paris and London and Wales, but it has 3 plots of relationships and timescales that are tightly woven into a single story. Sounds very intriguing. And finally, I picked up a copy of Berlin, Alexanderplatz by Alfred Doblin because the wonderful booktuber Mel recommended that I should read this novel because I was going on a trip to Berlin and I wanted to read it while I was in Berlin, but it's a very long novel, Mel, so I wasn't able to read it over that long weekend because it would have meant I wouldn't have seen Berlin at all. I would have just sat in my hotel room reading this novel all the time. But I'm really interested to read this novel and read more fiction about Berlin because it is such a fascinating city. So, phew, those are all the books I have to talk to you about. I know it's a lot, but I'm really interested and excited by all these books. So let me know which ones you are most interested in, and if you've read any of them, what you think of them. So I hope you're doing well and have a good October. I'll speak to you again soon, and happy reading, everyone.